The constable arrived within 20 minutes, a man named Inspector James Whitley, who had served St. Mary Mead for the better part of a decade. He was competent rather than brilliant, the sort of policeman who followed procedure and expected that procedure would lead him to the truth. He had cordoned off the Great Hall with strips of white tape and was now taking preliminary statements from anyone who claimed to have witnessed anything unusual. The body had been carefully removed from beneath the bell, a task that had required 4 men and considerable mechanical assistance. Margaret Hartley, in death, looked smaller somehow, less substantial than she had in life. The doctor had arrived and departed again, his preliminary assessment being that death had been instantaneous. The bell weighed, Edmund had confirmed with a tremor in his voice, approximately 300 pounds. There was no surviving such a fall. By 4 o'clock, word had spread through the village with the efficiency of wildfire. Those who had been at the festival had spread the news to those who had not, and by 5 o'clock, nearly everyone in St. Mary Mead knew that Margaret Hartley was dead. The reactions Miss Marple noted from her position near the refreshment tent, where she had positioned herself with remarkable strategic sense, were variously shocked, concerned, and, in a few notable cases, oddly relieved. Eleanor Marsh had taken the news particularly well, considering. She stood now with a group of village women near the mulled wine station, her eyes bright with the particular gleam they took on when she was processing information that would shortly become gossip. Of course, Eleanor was saying, her voice pitched at that particular volume that managed to carry quite far while maintaining the pretense of discretion. No one knew a thing about her. Kept herself locked away in that cottage, like she had something to hide. 8 months she's been here, and not once did she attend the Women's Institute meeting. Not once. I always said there was something off about a woman who wouldn't participate in village life. Mrs. Angela Thompson, wife of the grocer, nodded along, though her expression suggested she was less interested in Margaret's social failings than in the sheer drama of the situation. But to come to the festival at all, Angela said slowly. That's what I can't understand. She never came to anything. Why would she come to this? Probably wanted to have a look at the bell, Eleanor suggested. Edmund's been quite vocal about his accomplishment with it. Perhaps she wanted to see what all the fuss was about. This explanation satisfied no one, least of all Miss Marple, who continued to sip her tea and observe the various emotional displays unfolding around her with the interest of a naturalist, studying an exotic species. Near the manor's entrance, Edmund Ashford stood in consultation with Inspector Whitley. Edmund's face had taken on a greyish hue, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the interior of the house. Catherine Ashford stood beside him, one hand resting on his arm in a gesture that appeared to be supportive but which Miss Marple noticed was held with considerable rigidity. Catherine's expression was carefully composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was working quite hard to maintain her composure. Violet Pemberton, by contrast, had recovered remarkably well from her earlier hysteria. She sat in a chair that had been brought from inside the manor, wrapped in a blanket despite the fact that the day, while cold, was not frigid enough to require such precautions. She was giving a statement to a young constable, and her account of events seemed to be the standard narrative. She had been inside the manor, attending to some last-minute details for the evening's activities. She had heard a terrible crack, like thunder, from the direction of the great hall. She had rushed to investigate and found the bell had fallen, and Margaret had been crushed beneath it. She had screamed and run to alert the others. The young constable was taking notes, his expression one of dutiful concentration. He had not, Miss Marple observed, asked Violet what she had been doing inside the manor in the first place, or why she alone seemed to have been present at the moment of the accident. These were questions that might have been asked by someone who had studied the nature of human behavior for 7 decades, but they were not questions that young constables typically knew to ask. The Reverend Clemens stood apart from the main groups, his expression troubled. He had removed his glasses and was cleaning them on a handkerchief, a nervous habit that suggested his mind was working through some theological difficulty. Miss Marple knew the Reverend reasonably well. He had taken over the parish 5 years ago, replacing the previous vicar, and he was a conscientious man, if somewhat given to overthinking moral complexities. As she watched, young Thomas Harrow approached the Reverend, his face troubled. Thomas was the son of the local farmer, a man of perhaps 25 years who had recently returned from university with vague plans to modernize his father's agricultural enterprise. The two men spoke in low voices, and though Miss Marple could not hear their words, their body language suggested an urgent conversation of some importance. By 6 o'clock, the festival had been officially abandoned, and the grounds had taken on the peculiar atmosphere of a crime scene. The band's instruments lay silent on their platform. The vendor stalls remained, looking suddenly shabby and out of place, their Christmas decorations now seeming more mournful than festive. The tea would grow cold in the urns, and the homemade biscuits would eventually be distributed to those village residents who had the appetite for them, which Miss Marple suspected would be very few indeed. As darkness fell, and the electric lights along the pathways flickered to life, casting long shadows across the frozen grass, Miss Marple made her way slowly back to her cottage. She had learned what she needed to know from the immediate reactions of the village, and she had several observations that she intended to meditate upon in the quiet of her own home. One detail in particular occupied her thoughts as she walked. Violet Pemberton had mentioned hearing a crack like thunder from inside the manor. Yet the great hall doors opened onto the south lawn, directly visible from where Violet claimed to have been. If she had truly been attending to details inside the manor at a distance from those doors, the sound of the bell falling would have been muffled, not sharp enough to have registered, as clearly as her account suggested. It was a small inconsistency, the sort of thing that might have meant nothing at all. But Miss Marple had learned, over many decades, that small inconsistencies were rather like loose threads in a tapestry. Pull them gently, and sometimes entire sections began to unravel. Miss Marple's cottage was situated on the edge of the village, a small Tudor-style property with leaded windows and a garden that she tended with meticulous care. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated comforts of a lifetime. Worn armchairs, shelves laden with books and various knitted items that spoke of countless hours spent with needlework. She made herself a simple supper of soup and bread, then settled into her favorite chair by the fire with a cup of chamomile tea. Her mind, however, was not at rest. The events of the afternoon played through her memory with the precision of a film reel, and she found herself examining each moment, each word, each glance with the intensity that had made her such an unexpected instrument of justice in matters of crime. The knock at her door came at 9:30, just as she was preparing to retire for the evening. It was unusual to receive visitors at such an hour, but Miss Marple was not particularly surprised to find Inspector Whitley standing on her doorstep, looking somewhat sheepish and considerably tired. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I do apologize for the late hour, but I wonder if I might have a word with you. I was told by several villagers that you have something of a reputation for observation." Miss Marple smiled gently and invited him inside. She settled him in the chair opposite hers and offered him tea, which he accepted with visible relief. The inspector was a man of perhaps 45, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life dealing with the complications that arose when people lived in close proximity to one another. "I've been puzzling over this afternoon," Whitley began, once he had warmed his hands around the teacup. "The preliminary investigation suggests that the bell's fall was almost certainly an accident. The rope system was old, and Edmund Ashford admits he hadn't had it properly inspected in some years. The mechanism simply gave way. And yet," Miss Marple said, "you have come to visit an elderly schoolteacher at 9:30 in the evening. That suggests, Inspector, that something about the accident troubles you." Whitley smiled despite his fatigue. "Yes, well, that's precisely why I'm here. I've been asking questions about Mrs. Hartley, Margaret Hartley, and I've learned something rather curious. No one in the village knew anything about her. No family connections, no previous acquaintances, nothing. She simply arrived 8 months ago and withdrew from all social contact. That in itself is not so unusual," Miss Marple observed. "There are always people who prefer solitude." "True enough," Whitley agreed, "but here's what troubles me. I spoke with her landlord, old Mr. Pembroke, and he mentioned that Margaret paid her rent in cash, always exactly on time, always with enough for several months in advance. He also mentioned that she received visitors occasionally, men in suits who would arrive in expensive motor cars and leave after brief conversations. Mr. Pembroke thought it rather odd that someone so reclusive would have such visitors. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. Did he describe these visitors? He couldn't really, they always came in the evening and he never got a good look. But he was quite certain there had been several of them and that they looked, in his words, official. Official, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. She rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the dark garden. Inspector, did you happen to notice whether Miss Violet Pemberton was surprised to learn of Margaret Hartley's death? Whitley blinked at the apparent change of subject. Miss Pemberton? No, actually, now that you mention it. She was shocked, certainly, but there was something almost, I don't know how to describe it. Resigned, perhaps? As though she had been expecting something of the sort. And did you ask Miss Pemberton what she was doing inside the manor at the precise moment the bell fell? She said she was arranging flowers for the evening reception. In December, Miss Marple said softly. When flowers are neither plentiful nor particularly seasonal. Whitley leaned forward. You think there's something suspicious about H. presence there? Miss Marple turned from the window and regarded the inspector with an expression of gentle gravity. I think, Inspector, that before we conclude anything about how or why Margaret Hartley came to be beneath that bell, we might do well to learn something about who Margaret Hartley actually was. A woman who receives visits from official gentlemen, who pays her rent in cash, and who has gone to considerable effort to remain unknown in a village where everyone knows everyone else. Such a woman does not simply decide to attend a Christmas festival on a whim. Are you suggesting, Whitley said slowly, that her presence at the festival was deliberate? I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Miss Marple corrected gently. I am merely observing that coincidences, while they do occur, are less common than most people suppose. And I am also observing that the village's reaction to her death has been notably lacking in genuine grief. No one seems particularly distressed by her passing. They seem rather relieved, as though some unresolved tension has been released. Whitley set down his teacup and rose to his feet, his expression troubled but thoughtful. I shall make some inquiries about her background, he said. Perhaps there's a record of who she was, where she came from. That would be wise, Miss Marple agreed. And, Inspector, I would suggest you also make inquiries about what brought Miss Violet Pemberton to St. Mary Mead. People do not typically come to spend the Christmas season with relatives they are attempting to avoid. After Whitley had departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting, but her hands moved through the familiar motions almost mechanically. Her mind was elsewhere, constructing and reconstructing the events of the afternoon, examining them from different angles, searching for the pattern that she sensed lay beneath the surface of this apparent accident. By the time she retired to bed, she had arrived at a preliminary conclusion. It was not a pleasant one, and she could not yet support it with anything approaching concrete evidence. But it was, she reflected as she settled beneath her quilt, a beginning. The Sunday morning following Margaret Hartley's death dawned grey and cold, with the promise of snow hanging heavy in the sky. St. Mary Mead's church was fuller than usual for the weekly service, though Miss Marple suspected this had less to do with spiritual devotion than with the opportunity to discuss the previous day's events in the socially acceptable environment of a place of worship. The Reverend Clemens delivered a sermon on the fragility of life and the importance of Christian charity, his words seeming to carry particular weight given the circumstances. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, third from the front on the left side, and observed the congregation with the careful attention she normally reserved for her knitting patterns. Edmund Ashford occupied his customary place in the front row, but his usual composed dignity had been replaced by something more fragile. Catherine sat beside him, her posture rigid, her jaw set in a manner that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. Violet Pemberton, surprisingly, had not attended the service at all, a notable absence given that she was ostensibly staying with her cousin. Young Thomas Harrow sat with his father, the elder Harrow a stern-faced man whose expression suggested that nothing, Not even sudden death in the village would divert him from his disapproval of his son's life choices. But Thomas seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the back of the church, where Inspector Whitley stood, observing the proceedings with the expression of a man who understood that criminals often returned to the scene of their crime, or at least to places where their actions might be discussed. After the service concluded, Miss Marple remained seated while the congregation filed past. She had learned over the years that the moments immediately following social gatherings often revealed more truth than the gatherings themselves. People's guards were down, their attention divided, their carefully constructed facades sometimes slipping just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Eleanor Marsh paused beside her pew, ostensibly to greet her, though her real motivation was clearly to share the latest information she had gathered. "Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful about poor Margaret?" Eleanor began, settling herself on the pew beside Miss Marple, despite there being no invitation to do so. "I've been thinking about it all night, and I simply cannot understand what she was doing at the festival at all. The woman was practically a hermit." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And have you heard?" Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Inspector Whitley has been asking questions about her background. Apparently, no one can find any records of where she came from. It's as though she simply materialized 8 months ago with money in her pocket and no past to speak of." Miss Marple turned to regard Eleanor with an expression of polite interest. "How very curious. And what explanation have you constructed for such a mysterious arrival?" Eleanor flushed slightly at being so transparently caught in the act of gossiping. "Well, I couldn't say for certain, but there are those who have suggested she might have been fleeing from something, or someone. A difficult marriage, perhaps, or some financial impropriety." "How very creative," Miss Marple said. "Though I wonder if the truth might be considerably more prosaic. Sometimes people simply wish to start afresh in a new location, without any dramatic past to conceal." Eleanor looked disappointed by this rational response, and soon took her leave, moving on to other parishioners who might provide more satisfying material for speculation. Once she had gone, Miss Marple rose and made her way out of the church. Outside, the December air bit sharply at her face, and the promised snow had begun to fall in light flurries. The churchyard was quiet, most of the congregation having hurried homeward to their Sunday dinners. But near the lych gate, she encountered Thomas Harrow standing alone, his expression troubled. "Good morning, Thomas," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You look as though something is weighing on your mind." Thomas started, as though he had not noticed her approach. "Miss Marple? Yes, well, I suppose I do have something troubling me." He glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. "It's about yesterday, about Margaret Hartley. I'm not certain, but I think I might have seen her arrive at the festival. This morning I was thinking about it, and I remembered seeing her near the Manor's east entrance, quite early in the afternoon. She seemed to be looking for something, or perhaps meeting someone." "And did she find them?" Miss Marple inquired. "I don't know. I wasn't paying close attention at the time. But it occurred to me this morning that if she went inside the Manor, someone must have let her in. It's not the sort of place one simply wanders into." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That is a very astute observation, Thomas. Have you mentioned this to Inspector Whitley?" Thomas shook his head. "No, and I'm not certain I should. It seems like such a small thing, and I don't want to. That is, I wouldn't want to cause trouble for anyone by suggesting they admitted her to the house. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "if someone did admit her to the use, that someone might have knowledge about how she came to be beneath the bell. Such knowledge could hardly be considered troublesome, could it? It would merely be factual information." Thomas looked troubled, but nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose you're right. I'll speak to the inspector." As Thomas hurried away, Miss Marple stood in the churchyard, watching the snow fall onto the gravestones. She had now confirmed what she had begun to suspect the previous evening. Margaret Hartley's presence at the festival had been neither accidental nor impulsive. Someone had arranged for her to be there. Someone had let her into the manor house. And that someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had also arranged for her to be standing directly beneath the bell at the precise moment it fell. The question was no longer whether Margaret's death was an accident. The question was which of the village's residents had deliberately arranged her murder, and why they had deemed it necessary to do so. By Monday morning, Inspector Whitley had begun his inquiries in earnest, and the results were both illuminating and troubling. Miss Marple learned of them through the informal network of village communication. Eleanor Marsh had overheard a conversation at the post office, which had been relayed to Mrs. Thompson at the grocer's, which had eventually reached Miss Marple through the simple expedient of her visiting the market for fresh vegetables. Margaret Hartley had no official records, no birth certificate on file, no employment history, no previous residence that could be traced. It was as though the woman had materialized fully formed 8 months ago, complete with cash and a rented cottage, but entirely devoid of a past. The inspector had sent inquiries to London, to the Home Office, and to various government agencies, but thus far had received nothing but bureaucratic silence. More int. Riggingly, Thomas Harrow's information had been confirmed. Violet Pemberton had indeed admitted Margaret to the manor house on Saturday afternoon. When questioned, Violet had explained that Margaret had sent her a note requesting entry, claiming she wished to speak privately with Catherine Ashford about a matter of some importance. Violet had obliged, showing Margaret to the drawing-room where she was told Catherine would meet her shortly. Violet had then returned to her flower arrangements, and the next she heard of Margaret Hartley was the sound of the bell falling. The explanation was plausible. It was also, Miss Marple reflected as she sat in her garden on Monday afternoon, almost certainly a lie. What troubled her most was not the lie itself, but its construction. It was a lie designed to appear truthful, vague enough to be difficult to disprove, yet specific enough to seem credible. It was the lie of someone who had thought through the implications of her actions and prepared a narrative in advance. On Monday evening, Miss Marple received another visitor. This time it was Mrs. Catherine Ashford herself, arriving in her motor car with the determined expression of a woman on a mission. She declined tea but accepted a seat in the parlor, and her first words were delivered with the intensity of someone who had been holding them in for some time. "Miss Marple, I have come to you because I believe you have a reputation for discretion and understanding," Catherine began without preamble, "and because I suspect you may have observed things about Saturday's events that others have missed." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most productive conversations were those in which one said very little. Catherine took a breath. "Margaret Hartley was not a stranger to our family. I knew her years ago before I married Edmund. We were friends, though that friendship ended under circumstances that I have never fully explained to anyone. When I saw that she had rented the cottage in this village, I was shocked. I contacted her, and we came to an understanding that we would maintain a polite distance. We would acknowledge each other's presence in the village, but we would not socialize. It was an arrangement that suited us both." "And yet," Miss Marple observed, "on Saturday, Miss Pemberton informed her that you wished to speak with her privately." Catherine's face paled slightly. Violet did not send that note. "I did not request any meeting. When Margaret arrived at the manor, I was genuinely surprised. Violet came to find me and informed me that Margaret had arrived and wished to speak with me. I went to the drawing-room, but Margaret was not there. Instead, I found her standing in the great hall, staring up at the bell. When she saw me, she said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since." "And what was that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She said, 'It's magnificent. Edmund has become quite talented with his hands, hasn't he?' There was something in her tone, something almost knowing, as though the bell meant something to her beyond its aesthetic value." Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful consideration. And then there was a sound, a crack like wood breaking. And before I could respond to what she had said, the bell began to fall. I tried to pull her away, but I wasn't fast enough. The whole thing came down so quickly. There was no time to do anything. Catherine's voice had become thin and strained by the end of her account, and her hands trembled as she clasped them together. But Miss Marple noticed something that Catherine herself did not seem to realize. The woman's account was almost too dramatic, too perfectly timed. A. Crack, the bell falling, no time to react. It was the narrative of someone who could not have prevented what occurred, even had she wished to do so. "Did you see anyone else in the Great Hall at that moment?" Miss Marple inquired. "Anyone who might have been near the rope mechanism or the bell suspension?" Catherine shook her head. "No, we were alone. At least I thought we were. Though I suppose someone could have been on the upper balcony, out of sight." "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured, though not unkindly. After Catherine had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She now had confirmation of something she had begun to suspect. Margaret Hartley had been deliberately lured to the manor, deliberately positioned beneath the bell. But the true question remained unanswered. Which of the Ashfords had orchestrated her death, and what secret from their shared past with Margaret had made her death seem necessary? More pressingly still, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Catherine's account of being unable to save Margaret was truthful, or whether it was the carefully constructed alibi of someone who had planned, with meticulous precision, the murder of a woman whose very presence in the village had become intolerable. Tuesday morning brought a development that Miss Marple had not anticipated, though in retrospect she recognized that she should have. Inspector Whitley arrived at her cottage just after breakfast, his expression grim and his demeanour suggesting that sleep had eluded him the previous night. Margaret Hartley was not her real name, he announced without preamble, settling heavily into the chair that had become his customary seat during their recent conversations. "I received a response this morning from contacts at Scotland Yard. Her actual name was Margaret Ashford. She was Edmund Ashford's first wife." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "His first wife," she repeated. "But Edmund has been married to Catherine for how many years?" 23 years, Whitley confirmed. Margaret disappeared approximately 25 years ago. At the time, Edmund reported her missing, and there was a brief investigation, but she was never found. She was presumed dead, likely a victim of foul play. Edmund eventually obtained a declaration of presumed death, waited the requisite period, and married Catherine 5 years after Margaret's disappearance. The implications hung between them, vast and complicated. Miss Marple found herself revising her understanding of the events that had led to Margaret's death. This was not a matter of old friendship or past grievances. This was something far more serious. And Margaret, the real Margaret, had been missing all these years? Miss Marple inquired. According to Scotland Yard, yes. But here's where it becomes more interesting. They found records suggesting that Margaret had been living under an assumed name in various locations across Europe for the past 2 decades. She appears to have been in contact with Scotland Yard approximately 6 months ago, requesting their assistance with something. The details are classified, but the timing coincides precisely with her arrival in St. Mary Mead. "She came here deliberately," Miss Marple said, understanding flooding through her with the clarity of water finding its level. "She came here because she intended to confront Edmund." "And Catherine?" Whitley nodded grimly. "That would appear to be the case. The question now is whether Edmund or Catherine, or both, learned of her presence and took action to silence her before she could reveal whatever she had learned while she was missing." "You believe one of them killed her," Miss Marple said quietly. "I believe, Whitley correct, Ted, that one of them arranged for that bell to fall at the precise moment Margaret Hartley was standing beneath it. The bell's rope system was not weakened by age or neglect. It was deliberately cut. We've had a specialist examine it, and the evidence is unmistakable. Someone severed the main support rope, knowing that it would fail when sufficient weight was applied to the bell system." Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the frost-covered garden. The pieces were assembling themselves into a pattern now, though it was not yet a complete picture. And when was the rope severed? That's what we can't determine precisely. The mechanism was damaged when the bell fell, obscuring the cut marks. But it must have been some time before Saturday afternoon. Within the week, almost certainly. Then, whoever cut the rope knew that Margaret would be beneath the bell on Saturday, Miss Marple mused. They knew she would be there because they arranged for her to be there, and they arranged it in such a way that her death would appear to be an accident. She turned back to face the inspector. "Tell me, has anyone examined the note that Margaret supposedly sent to Violet Pemberton, requesting a meeting with Catherine?" Whitley's expression darkened. "We've looked for it, but Violet claims she destroyed it. Says it seemed like a private matter, and she didn't want to keep correspondence of that nature." "How very convenient," Miss Marple said, echoing her words from the previous evening. "And has anyone asked Violet whether she might have written the note herself?" The question hung in the air between them. Whitley's face registered the implications. "You think Violet Pemberton orchestrated this?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it would be prudent to learn more about Violet Pemberton's relationship to the Ashford family. Why is she staying with them? How long has she been in residence? What is her financial situation? These are questions that might illuminate matters considerably." After Whitley had departed, Miss Marple found herself pacing her small parlour, her mind working through the various threads that composed this increasingly complex tapestry. Violet's arrival at Thornfield Manor, her suspiciously steady hands when she screamed about finding Margaret's body, her convenient placement inside the manor at the precise moment Margaret arrived. All of these elements suggested premeditation and planning. But to what end? What possible motive could Violet have for killing a woman she had never met before Margaret arrived in the village? Unless, Miss Marple reflected, Violet had met Margaret before. Unless there was a connection that had not yet been revealed. Miss Marple made a decision. She would pay a call to Thornfield Manor. She would speak with Violet Pemberton herself, armed not with accusations but with careful observation, watching for the small inconsistencies and reactions that might betray the truth. She dressed with particular care, selecting a dress that emphasized her harmless, elderly appearance. She pinned her hair with precision and applied a modest amount of face powder. She would appear exactly as she always did, a pleasant, slightly eccentric elderly woman with a reputation for knowing village gossip and absolutely no capacity for independent investigation. It was the perfect disguise, because it was no disguise at all. It was simply the truth, observed from a very particular angle. The walk to Thornfield Manor took approximately 20 minutes, following the winding lane that led through the village's outskirts and into the parkland that surrounded the Ashford estate. The day was cold but clear, the morning frost having melted into damp patches of earth and grass. Miss Marple walked with the UNH, hurried pace of someone for whom time held no particular urgency, and her mind continued its methodical work, examining each piece of information from multiple angles. She was greeted at the manor's door by Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who seemed unsurprised by her arrival. Apparently, visitors were expected to call, even during the tumultuous circumstances of an ongoing murder investigation. Miss Marple was shown into the drawing-room, a comfortable space appointed with the sort of furniture that suggested generations of Ashford habitation and considerable, though not ostentatious, wealth. Violet Pemberton rose from her seat when Miss Marple entered. She was dressed impeccably in a grey wool dress, her hair arranged with precision, her face composed but bearing the faint signs of stress that Miss Marple had learned to recognize. There was a tightness around the eyes, a quality to her smile that suggested it was being maintained through conscious effort rather than genuine pleasure. "Miss Marple," Violet said warmly, "how lovely of you to call. I confess I have found this dreadful business quite upsetting, and visitors have been few. Most people seem to regard the house as somehow tainted by what occurred. People often behave irrationally when confronted with sudden death," Miss Marple observed, accepting a seat. "They tend to avoid association with the location of the tragedy, as though proximity to death might somehow contaminate them. It's quite natural if rather uncharitable." Violet poured tea with a steady hand, something Miss Marple noted carefully, and the two women settled into the sort of conversation that would have appeared to any observer to be simple social pleasantry. But Miss Marple was not merely engaging in pleasant discourse. She was watching Violet's reactions, listening not just to her words, but to the cadence and hesitations in her speech, observing the minute changes in her expression as various topics were broached. "I must confess," Miss Marple began, after suitable preliminaries about the weather and the unfortunate disruption to the Christmas festivities, that I have found myself quite puzzled by the whole affair. Margaret Hartley seemed to have no connections to anyone in the village, and yet she came to the festival. It strikes me as unusual. Yes, it was rather odd, Violet agreed, her tone remaining light. I couldn't imagine what brought her to the gathering. She had been so withdrawn since her arrival. And yet you admitted her to the manor when she requested entry, Miss Marple observed gently. That suggests you had more familiarity with her than the rest of the village. A pause, a fraction too long to be natural. Well, when she sent the note, I felt it would be churlish to refuse her. And Catherine, after all, had indicated some willingness to renew an old acquaintance. I thought I was being helpful. The note, Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup with the delicate precision that belied the sharpness of her observation. You mentioned destroying it. That seems a pity. It would have been interesting to examine Margaret's handwriting, to see whether her manner of expression was consistent with what one might expect from a woman who had been living abroad for 2 decades. Violet's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, the first genuine crack in her composure. I simply didn't think it important. I assumed it would all be rather straightforward. Tell me, Miss Marple continued conversationally, how long have you been staying with the Ashfords? Catherine mentioned that you had come for the Christmas season, but I confess I'm uncertain whether that means you arrived recently or whether you have been here for some weeks. I arrived 6 weeks ago, Violet said, and Miss Marple noticed that this fact seemed to be admitted reluctantly. Edmund and Catherine were kind enough to invite me for an extended stay. I've been having some difficulties with my finances, and they generously offered me accommodation. This was new information, and Miss Marple filed it away carefully. A woman in financial difficulty was a woman with potential motive, but motive for what exactly? Unless Violet had some connection to Margaret Hartley that had not yet been revealed. How generous of them, Miss Marple said. You must have considerable family connections, then, for Catherine to extend such an invitation. Actually, Violet said, and now her voice carried a note of something that might have been bitterness. Catherine and I are more distantly related than one might assume. We share a great-grandmother. It's a connection that has become more meaningful since my circumstances became difficult. Miss Marple absorbed this information. A distant family connection, financial troubles, an extended stay that had begun approximately 6 weeks ago, precisely the time frame during which Margaret Hartley had apparently begun her contact with the authorities regarding whatever business had brought her back to St. Mary Mead. And before you came to stay with the Ashfords, Miss Marple pressed gently, where were you living? In London, mostly. I had a small flat in Kensington. How lovely. And did you happen to know anyone else who lived in London during that time? Anyone connected to the Ashford family, perhaps? Violet set down her teacup with rather more force than was necessary. When she looked at Miss Marple again, her expression had shifted. The pleasant social mask had slipped, and what lay beneath was something considerably less comfortable, something that suggested Miss Marple had ventured into territory that Violet had hoped would remain unexamined. I don't see how that's relevant, Violet said coolly. Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, I find myself wondering whether you might have encountered Margaret Hartley in London before she came to St. Mary Mead. Whether you might have recognized her when she arrived, and taken steps to ensure that whatever business brought her here would be concluded as quickly and as finally as possible. The silence that followed was profound. Violet rose from her seat and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. For a long moment she said nothing, and Miss Marple recognized the signs of someone wrestling with a decision. The silence stretched between them, laden with unspoken truths and the weight of secrets finally approaching the moment of disclosure. You're very clever, Violet said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Cleverer than I gave you credit for. Cleverer than the inspector, certainly. Not particularly clever, Miss Marple replied. Merely observant. I have spent a great many years watching people, and I have learned that the patterns of human behavior are remarkably consistent. People in difficult financial circumstances often make choices they would not otherwise make. People who have encountered someone from their past often carry traces of that encounter in their expressions and reactions. Violet turned from the window. Her face had undergone a transformation. The careful composure had fallen away entirely, replaced by an expression of profound weariness. "I didn't kill her," she said. "I want to be absolutely clear about that. I did not kill Margaret Hartley." "But you knew who she was," Miss Marple said. "It was not a question—" "Yes, I knew her. Or rather, I knew of her. I met her in London approximately 8 months ago. She approached me in a café. She had recognized me from a photograph, apparently. She told me who she was, what had happened to her, and what she intended to do about it." Miss Marple gestured for Violet to resume her seat. "Please, tell me the entire story. I suspect it is more complex than it might initially appear." Violet settled back into her chair, her shoulders sagging as though relieved of a tremendous burden. Margaret was Edmund's first wife. "That much I assume you know by now. What you may not know is that Edmund did not report her missing. Catherine did. Margaret disappeared and Edmund was devastated, but when the authorities began their investigation, it was Catherine who provided the most detailed account of what had happened. Catherine who suggested that Edmund might have had something to do with it. Catherine who, eventually, helped Edmund obtain the declaration of presumed death that allowed him to move forward with his life. And Margaret?" Miss Marple prompted. "Margaret had been imprisoned. That's the only way to describe it, though it was never officially recorded as such. She had been confined to a private sanatorium on the continent, under an assumed name, with all records sealed. She escaped approximately 2 years ago and has spent the intervening time gathering evidence and contacting authorities. She came to St. Mary Mead because she intended to expose what had been done to her and to reveal who had orchestrated her disappearance." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming themselves into a configuration that she had not anticipated. Catherine arranged her disappearance, yes. But Catherine did not act alone. Edmund was complicit, though whether through genuine involvement or through Catherine's manipulation, I cannot say with certainty. What I can tell you is that Margaret had proof. Letters, medical records, testimony from people who had been paid to keep her confined. She intended to go to the authorities on Sunday, the day after the festival. She never reached Sunday, Miss Marple observed quietly. "No," Violet said. "She did not." "And your role in all of this?" Miss Marple asked gently. Violet's hands twisted together in her lap. "I was blackmailed. When Margaret first contacted me, she needed someone inside the Ashford household, someone who could observe, who could report back, who could potentially help her retrieve additional evidence she believed was hidden in the manor. I refused. I wanted nothing to do with it. But then Catherine found out about my financial difficulties. She offered me money, a considerable sum, to come stay with them. She said it was family charity, but I understood the real message. She had learned that Margaret had contacted me. She was buying my silence by putting me under her roof, where she could watch me. But Margaret came to the manor anyway, Miss Marple said, on Saturday. Why? Because she had grown impatient, because she believed that if she confronted Edmund and Catherine directly, if she forced the issue, she could compel them to confess before they could act against her. She sent me the note asking me to arrange a meeting with Catherine. She believed that if Catherine knew she was there, if there were witnesses to the confrontation, she would be safe. But she was not safe, Miss Marple said. No. The bell was rigged beforehand. I don't know exactly when or by whom, but it was ready, waiting. All that was required was for Margaret to position herself in the correct location. Miss Marple regarded Violet with an expression that was not unsympathetic, but which carried considerable gravity. You knew about this. Not beforehand, perhaps, but you realized what had occurred, and you did not warn her. Violet flinched as though struck. I didn't know. Not for certain. I suspected afterward that it had been deliberately arranged, but I had no proof, and by then it was too late. And if I'm being entirely honest with myself, a part of me was relieved. A part of me was grateful that the problem had resolved itself so conveniently. The problem, Miss Marple repeated. A human being is not a problem to be resolved, Miss Pemberton. A human being is a life, with all its attendant complexity and claim to dignity. I know that, Violet said, her voice breaking. I know it perfectly well, but I was frightened. I still am. Catherine Ashford is not a woman to be trifled with, and Edmund, for all his gentle demeanour, is a man capable of terrible things when properly motivated. Miss Marple rose to her feet. I believe you should speak with Inspector Whitley. You should tell him everything you have told me. You may find yourself facing charges for your involvement in this matter, however peripheral it may be. But silence will only compound your culpability. As Miss Marple made her way toward the door, Violet spoke once more, her voice barely audible. Who do you think did it? Catherine or Edmund? Miss Marple paused at the threshold. I think, she said slowly, that is a question that will require considerably more investigation to answer with certainty. But I suspect it is a question whose answer will surprise you considerably. Miss Marple's walk back through the village was conducted at her usual measured pace, but her mind moved with considerably greater velocity. The revelations from Violet Pemberton had provided crucial context, but they had not yet resolved the central mystery. Two people had the opportunity and motive to kill Margaret Hartley, Edmund and Catherine Ashford. Yet there remained the question of which one had actually severed the rope, which one had orchestrated the murder with such careful precision. She was passing the village green when she encountered young Thomas Harrow, who appeared to have been waiting for her, judging by the way he stepped forward as soon as she came into view. Miss Marple, he said urgently, I've been hoping to speak with you. The inspector has been making inquiries, and I've remembered something else about Saturday. Something I didn't mention before because I wasn't certain it was important. Do walk with me, Miss Marple suggested, and the two of them continued along the lane toward her cottage. Thomas fell into step beside her, his youthful face troubled. I saw Edmund in the manor grounds on Saturday morning, quite early, before the festival had properly begun. He was alone, examining the rope system that holds up the great bell. I thought it odd at the time because he'd been quite proud of having the system professionally inspected only a few weeks ago, but then everything happened with Margaret, and I forgot all about it until this morning. And he was examining the rope? Miss Marple asked, keeping her voice conversational. Yes, he had a knife with him, a large one, the sort one might use for cutting rope. He was standing on a ladder, looking at where the main support rope attached to the ceiling mechanism. He seemed very focused on something, though I couldn't see what exactly. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the care it deserved. A knife, a ladder, an examination of the rope system. These were the actions of someone preparing for something specific, not the idle tinkering of a man merely checking on his work. Did he seem surprised to see you? Miss Marple inquired, startled more than surprised. He called out something about checking the mechanism, but his voice sounded strained, and afterward he seemed anxious. He asked me whether I planned to attend the festival, and when I said I would, he seemed almost disappointed. When they reached Miss Marple's cottage, she invited Thomas inside for tea, a gesture that seemed to both surprise and comfort the young man. As she prepared the beverage, her mind continued its work. Edmund had been preparing the mechanism. Edmund had access to Margaret. Edmund had the knowledge of how to ensure that the bell would fall at precisely the right moment. But there was something that did not quite fit, something about the pattern that suggested a layer of complexity that had not yet been fully revealed. Thomas, she said, as they settled with their cups, you mentioned that your father has been disapproving of your plans for the farm. Has there been any particular disagreement recently? Thomas looked startled by the change of subject. Well, yes, actually. Father wants me to sell the eastern pasture to Edmund Ashford. Edmund has been attempting to purchase it for quite some time, offering increasingly generous prices. But I don't want to sell. I have plans for that land, improvements, modernizations. Father thinks I'm being foolish and impractical, and Edmund has been persistent in his offers, very persistent. He seems quite determined to acquire it. I've never understood why, honestly. It's not particularly valuable land, and it's not as though the Ashford estate is in need of additional acreage. Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care. Here was a new thread, one that suggested motivations beyond the simple matter of Margaret's return. Edmund's interest in acquiring the Harrow land, his anxiety about the festival, his preparation of the rope mechanism. These elements began to suggest a narrative that extended beyond the past and into the present circumstances. "Thomas, I wonder if you would do something for me," Miss Marple said. "I wonder if you would speak with your father about why Edmund is so determined to purchase that particular pasture. Whether there is something about the land itself that makes it valuable, something beneath the surface, perhaps. Water rights, mineral deposits, that sort of thing." Thomas looked puzzled but nodded. "I can certainly ask him, though I confess I don't see how it's relevant to what happened to Margaret Hartley." "Neither do I, at present," Miss Marple admitted. "But I have found that seemingly unrelated facts often prove to be quite intimately connected, once one understands the full context." After Thomas had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, and for the first time since Saturday's tragedy, she allowed herself to consider a possibility that she had been avoiding. What if Margaret's death was not the central crime, but rather a secondary one? What if her murder was not motivated by the need to silence her regarding Edmund's past actions toward her, but rather by the need to silence her regarding something else entirely? It was a chilling thought, and it suggested that the investigation had taken a turn toward considerably darker territory than anyone had yet realized. It suggested that the village of St. Mary Mead harbored not one murderer, but potentially two separate crimes, linked only by the fact that both benefited the same person. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk. She withdrew paper and pen, and began to write a letter to Inspector Whitley, detailing her observations and her developing theory. When she had finished, she sealed the envelope and set it aside to be delivered in the morning. Then, with the methodical care of someone who had learned long ago that understanding human nature required patience and attention to detail, she began to construct the final pieces of the puzzle. Inspector Whitley arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Wednesday morning, his expression suggesting that he had spent a considerable portion of the previous night processing the information contained in her letter. He carried with him a folder thick with documents and photographs, and his first words were delivered with the urgency of a man who had arrived at conclusions that disturbed him greatly. "The Harrow land," he said without preamble, settling into his customary chair. "I made inquiries as you suggested. The eastern pasture sits directly above an aquifer, a substantial underground water source. Edmund Ashford has apparently been attempting to acquire it for nearly 2 years now. He's been planning to develop a bottling operation to supply mineral water to London and the home counties. It would be quite lucrative. And the elder Harrow has refused to sell," Miss Marple said, consistently and firmly. "But here's where it becomes interesting. Thomas is technically correct in his assessment that the land isn't particularly valuable for agricultural purposes, but the elder Harrow knows about the water. Edmund has explained the situation to him, but Harrow refuses to sell because he believes the proper course is to work with the local council to ensure that any development benefits the village as a whole, rather than enriching Edmund personally." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A man of principle, then?" "Apparently so. But Edmund has been growing increasingly desperate. We've found records of conversations with investors, business associates, all of whom are expecting Edmund to deliver on promises he's made regarding the land acquisition. His financial situation has become precarious. If he cannot acquire the Harrow property, he faces significant losses, and Margaret's arrival," Miss Marple said carefully, "would have complicated his plans considerably." Whitley's expression darkened. "Yes. If Margaret were to publicly expose Edmund's role in her disappearance, if she were to bring charges against him, he would be unable to complete any business transactions. His reputation would be destroyed, his credibility shattered. No investor would touch him." "Which suggests," Miss Marple continued, "that Margaret's death served Edmund's immediate purpose. It eliminated the threat to his reputation and his financial prospects simultaneously." "Yes, but here's what troubles me," Whitley said, leaning forward. "I've been examining the rope mechanism quite carefully. The cut marks indicate that someone with considerable knowledge of the system would have had to perform the severing. Someone familiar with how the mechanism functioned, someone who understood precisely which rope would need to be cut to cause the bell to fall at the specific moment of maximum danger. Edmund designed the system himself. He would certainly possess that knowledge. But Catherine would not, Miss Marple observed, precisely, which would seem to point definitively toward Edmund. And yet, when I pressed him about his presence in the manor on Saturday morning, the ropes, he broke down entirely. He admitted that he had been preparing the mechanism, but he claims he never intended to harm Margaret. He claims he was simply ensuring that the rope would fail at a specific moment, later in the evening, after Margaret had presumably departed. Miss Marple felt a subtle shift in her understanding. He intended for the bell to fall, but not with Margaret beneath it. Exactly. He says he planned to stage an accident that would destroy the bell, which he could then use as justification for the construction of a new, more modern reception hall on the manor grounds. He hoped to convince Catherine to agree to sell the eastern portion of the manor lands to finance this new construction. Once he had land to sell, he could use the proceeds to complete the acquisition of the Harrow property. A remarkably elaborate scheme, Miss Marple murmured, and one that would have required Catherine's cooperation, which he apparently did not have, Whitley said. Catherine has consistently refused to countenance any sale of the manor grounds. She considers them family legacy. Edmund has been increasingly frustrated by her intransigence. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the frost-covered garden. The pattern was becoming clearer, but it remained incomplete. Edmund had prepared the mechanism, but not with the intention of killing Margaret. Someone else had ensured that Margaret would be standing beneath the bell at the precise moment it fell. Someone else had orchestrated her presence in the manor. Someone else had seen in her return an opportunity rather than merely a threat. "Inspector," she said slowly, turning back to face him, "I believe we have been examining this matter from an incomplete perspective. We have focused on Edmund because the mechanism bears the marks of his work, but we have not adequately considered Cat. Hérine's role in the events that followed Edmund's preparation of the rope." Whitley's expression shifted. "You think Catherine deliberately positioned Margaret beneath the bell?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Catherine understood Edmund's financial desperation. I think she understood that Margaret's return threatened not only Edmund's reputation, but also the family's security. And I think that when Margaret arrived at the manor on Saturday, Catherine saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems simultaneously. She would have had to know about the rope," Whitley objected. "She would have had to know that Edmund had prepared the mechanism to fail." "Would she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or might she simply have noticed Edmund's unusual activity on Saturday morning? Might she have followed him, observed what he was doing, and understood its implications? Catherine is an intelligent woman, Inspector. She has demonstrated considerable capacity for both deception and planning." Whitley stood and began to pace, his mind clearly working through the implications. If Catherine deliberately lured Margaret to the spot beneath the bell, knowing that the mechanism was prepared to fail, then she committed premeditated murder. She arranged for Margaret to be there. She ensured that Margaret would be in position when the bell fell. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "And more than that, she made use of her husband's own preparations to accomplish her goal. She turned his scheme, however misguided, into an instrument of murder. Edmund prepared the rope to stage an accident. Catherine transformed that prepared accident into a genuine one." Whitley stopped pacing. "I need to speak with Catherine. I need to confront her with this theory." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But, Inspector, I would suggest that you do so carefully. A woman who has orchestrated one murder might not hesitate to attempt another if she feels sufficiently threatened. And Catherine has already demonstrated that she is capable of planning with considerable precision." As Whitley prepared to depart, Miss Marple spoke once more. "One final thought, Inspector. When you speak with Catherine, pay careful attention to her reaction when you mention the rope mechanism. Pay attention to whether she seems surprised that Edmund had prepared it to fail, or whether she seems to have known about it all along. The answer to that question will tell you whether Catherine acted on impulse or with premeditation." The confrontation between Inspector Whitley and Catherine Ashford took place on Wednesday afternoon in the drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, with Miss Marple present at the inspector's specific request. Catherine had agreed to the meeting with the composure of a woman who believed herself beyond reproach, though Miss Marple observed the faintest tremor in her hands as she poured tea for her visitors. "I'm afraid I must ask you some rather difficult questions, Mrs. Ashford," Whitley began, his tone carefully neutral. "Regarding your movements on Saturday, and regarding your knowledge of the rope mechanism in the Great Hall." Catherine's expression remained serene, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Inspector. I have nothing to hide. We have established that your husband prepared the rope mechanism to fail at a predetermined moment on Saturday evening," Whitley continued. "A mechanism designed to stage an accident involving the decorative bell. Did you know about this preparation?" The pause before Catherine's response was fractionally too long. "Edmund mentioned something about checking the mechanism," she said carefully. "I assumed it was routine maintenance." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, observed the calculation that flickered across Catherine's face. Catherine had not known, or at least Catherine had not known with certainty. This distinction mattered enormously. "And when Margaret Hartley arrived at the Manor on Saturday afternoon," Whitley continued, "requesting a meeting with you, what was your initial reaction?" "I was surprised, naturally, but I agreed to speak with her. It seemed the civilized thing to do." "And you met with her in the Great Hall," Whitley said. "Not in the drawing room, but in the Great Hall, where the bell hung from the mechanism your husband had just prepared." "That's where I found her, yes. She had gone to examine the bell rather than waiting for me in the drawing room." "How convenient," Whitley observed, and Catherine's composure slipped fractionally. "What are you suggesting, Inspector?" she asked, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "I'm suggesting," Whitley said carefully, "that when you discovered Margaret in the Great Hall, examining the bell that your husband had prepared to fall, you realized something. You realized that here was an opportunity. You realized that you could ensure Margaret never left that room alive." Catherine rose from her seat, her face flushing with anger. "That's a preposterous accusation. I was attempting to pull her away from the bell when it fell. I have told you this repeatedly." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "You have told the inspector that you attempted to pull her away. But what you have not explained, Mrs. Ashford, is why you positioned yourself on the opposite side of the Great Hall, the side nearest to the rope mechanism, rather than remaining close to Margaret as you spoke with her." Catherine turned to face Miss Marple with an expression of pure contempt. "I don't see how my position in the room is relevant, don't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "NK you do, Mrs. Ashford. I think you understand perfectly well that someone needed to be in position to trigger the fall. Someone needed to pull the secondary release mechanism that your husband had engineered, the mechanism that would allow the rope to be severed at a precise moment, rather than failing on its own schedule. And I think that someone was you." "This is absurd," Catherine spat. "You cannot possibly have evidence of such a thing." "Perhaps not concrete evidence," Whitley said, his voice hardening. "But we have statements from the Harrow family regarding Edmund's financial desperation. We have records of investors expecting him to deliver on promises regarding the Harrow property. We have physical evidence of the rope having been deliberately cut, and we have your own words, which contain a critical inconsistency." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "You claimed that you heard a crack, like thunder, and rushed to the Great Hall. But Thomas Harrow, who was present at the festival, stated that he saw you speaking with Margaret inside the manor at the precise moment the bell fell. You were already there, Mrs. Ashford. You had already positioned yourself where you needed to be." Catherine's face had gone pale. She sank back into her chair, and for a moment the carefully constructed facade of her composure crumbled entirely. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was going to destroy everything," Catherine said. "Everything Edmund and I had built together. Everything we had secured through decades of careful management. She was going to expose him, to ruin him, to tear apart the family and the estate, and everything that mattered." "So you killed her," Miss Marple said, not unkindly but with the clarity of absolute certainty. "I didn't plan to," Catherine said, and the words tumbled out with the force of a confession long held in check. "I truly didn't. When she arrived, when she came to the manor, I was shocked. I didn't know she was alive. Edmund had always told me. He had always said that she had died abroad, that she had taken her own life. I believed him. She looked toward the inspector, her eyes hollow. When I saw her, when I understood what had happened, I was terrified. Edmund is weak, you see. He is a good man in many ways, but he is weak. He would have confessed everything to her. He would have let her destroy us both. So I went to find him, to understand what was happening, and I saw him in the corridor near the great hall. He was agitated, frightened, and he told me about the rope, about the mechanism he had prepared, about his plan to convince me to sell the manor lands. Catherine's hands twisted together in her lap. I realized in that moment that fate had presented me with an opportunity. I realized that if Margaret were to be in the great hall when the bell fell, if I could ensure that the mechanism activated at precisely the right moment, her death would appear to be nothing more than a terrible accident. I called out to her, asking her to look at the bell. I positioned myself near the release mechanism, and when she turned to face me, when she was directly beneath the structure, I activated it. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Inspector Whitley's expression was one of grim satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who has solved a puzzle but who finds no joy in the solving. Miss Marple remained motionless in her chair, her ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been sorrow. "Catherine Ashford," Whitley said formally, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Margaret Hartley. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." As the inspector applied the handcuffs, Catherine looked once more toward Miss Marple. "How did you know?" she asked. "How could you possibly have known?" Miss Marple regarded her with an expression of profound sadness. "I have spent 7 decades watching human nature, Mrs. Ashford. I have seen how fear and desperation can transform ordinary people into capable of extraordinary acts. I have seen how love for a place, or a position, or a way of life can corrupt the soul more thoroughly than almost any other emotion. You loved Thornfield Manor more than you loved justice, more than you loved the sanctity of human life, and that love, in the end, was your undoing." In the days that followed, the village of St. Mary Mead underwent the peculiar process of reconciliation that follows great scandal. The Christmas festival remained cancelled, and the decorations that had seemed so festive only days earlier were quietly taken down and stored away. The broken bell was removed from the great hall, and Edmund Ashford, broken by the knowledge of his wife's crime and his own complicity in the events that had led to Margaret's death, announced his intention to retire from public life. Thomas Harrow visited Miss Marple one final time, to thank her for her intervention in the matter, and to inform her that his father, moved by the events of the past week, had agreed to donate the eastern pasture to a trust that would benefit the entire village. The aquifer beneath the land would be protected, and any future development would be undertaken with the community's welfare in mind. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the village in a blanket of white that obscured the places where tragedy had occurred. She thought of Margaret Hartley, a woman who had survived 25 years of confinement only to be murdered by the very woman who had aided her original disappearance. She thought of Edmund Ashford, a man whose weakness and desperation had contributed to his wife's descent into murderous action. And she thought of Catherine, whose love for a place had become so consuming that it had blinded her to the value of human life. The patterns of human behavior, Miss Marple reflected, were remarkably consistent across time and place. Fear and greed, love and desperation, the desperate need to preserve one's position in the world. These were the forces that drove people to commit acts they would never have thought themselves capable of. And yet, beneath all the complexity, beneath all the layers of motive and justification, the truth remained constant. Murder was murder, and the victim's death was the ultimate testimony to the killer's moral collapse. As the snow continued to fall, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more and resumed the familiar rhythms of her work. In the village below, Christmas preparations continued, subdued but persistent. Life, as it always did, would move forward. The village would heal, would recover, would eventually consign the tragedy to the realm of historical gossip. But for those who had been touched by the events of that dreadful Saturday, the scars would remain, and in her small cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple continued her quiet work of observation, secure in the knowledge that justice, however delayed, however complicated, had ultimately prevailed. The broken Christmas bell would be replaced with a new one, but the truth of what had occurred would endure, a permanent fixture in the collective memory of St. Mary Mead. The case was closed.